program. I'm pleased to welcome John Lansing, the CEO of the United States Agency for Global Media, Lea Gabrielle, Special Envoy and Coordinator of the State Department's Global Engagement Center, and Jim Kulikowski, who used to sit right over here. Welcome. Assistance Coordinator for Europe and Eurasia at the Department of State for today's first panel. For our second panel, we will be joined by Alina Polyakova, Director of the Project on Global Democracy and Emerging Technology at the Brookings Institution, and Nina Jankowicz, Global Fellow at the Kennan Institute. Since World War II, the mission of the United States international broadcasting has been to provide accurate news to those abroad who lack access to a free press and accurate information. But in today's interconnected world, information spreads more rapidly than ever before. While the United States is committed to advancing democratic principles, including freedom of speech and the press, Russia and others who do not share our values continue to utilize communication tools from traditional print to social media to targeted ads to do harm. Russian interference in the 2016 election was perhaps the most resounding wake-up call to this threat. 3 years later, the United States still lags in responding to malign foreign influence in the information space. Technological advancements such as deep fakes and synthetic videos have made these risks even greater. Our goal today is to better understand these threats and how our investments in the United States Agency for Global Media, or USAGM, are informing, engaging, connecting people around the world, and how those audiences receive, perceive, and share content. It is also helpful to understand whether our efforts through the Global Engagement Center, or GEC, to counter propaganda and disinformation from international terrorist organizations and foreign countries are effective. I should read that statement again, because that's really our concern. We appropriate many millions of dollars, and it's important for us to understand whether our procedures are effective. In fiscal year 2019, Congress appropriated $808 million to the United States Agency for Global Media, and more than $55 million to the Global Engagement Center. This included significant resources for a 24-hour Russian language television and digital news network for Russia, countries in Central and Eastern Europe and around the world. In the House-passed fiscal year 2020 appropriations, we provided funding to support data-driven programming and efforts to counter propaganda and extremist rhetoric. The United States has some of the best technology and marketing minds in the world. However, Russian disinformation campaigns only seem to be growing stronger. So it's clear to all of us that we have to adapt, innovate to effectively deliver programming and inform audiences. This is critical as disinformation has the potential to weaken democracies and to fan the rise of nationalist and anti-European Union sentiments in the region. We just can't continue to operate in a vacuum. The United States must utilize all our tools of public diplomacy to get our message out and win hearts and minds. To achieve this goal, we need a broader, strategic dialogue backed by research that considers audience reach, media consumption, behaviors, evolving information technology practices, and perception of messaging from various sources. To make significant progress against malign influence, we must consider how we can leverage the vast expertise and reach of the private sector in partnering to combat disinformation campaigns. So I truly welcome your thoughts today on all these topics. Before we hear your testimony, I would like to invite my ranking member, Mr. Rogers, to make remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And thank you for calling this very timely hearing. I want to join you and the others on the panel to this hearing, and we look forward to hearing the testimony and what I hope will be an interesting discussion on a very important topic. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Jim Kulikowski. Jim K., as we call him, served this committee knowledgeably and adeptly as Deputy Staff Director and Chief Counsel for the full committee, among several other distinguished positions during his 24 years of service with House Appropriations. Jim was a shrewd negotiator. We could always count on him to ensure House priorities came out on top in conference with our Senate brethren and sisters. So we're glad to see you back here in a new capacity and warmly welcome you back to the committee. During my time chairing this subcommittee, I had the opportunity to lead several of our members on 2 trips to all corners of Europe so we could see firsthand what Russia was up to. At each stop, we were confronted with the Kremlin's malign activity in one form or another. It's pervasive throughout Europe, Eurasia, Central Asia, as well as the Arctic. On the last trip, we went to Lithuania. There we had extraordinary conversations with several of their legislators and members of civil society as well, who described to us in detail a sophisticated disinformation campaign that they called Russian active measures. We were reminded that efforts by Moscow to discredit the United States and weaken the West are not new. In fact, these nefarious techniques date back to the former Soviet Union, and including tactics such as written or spoken disinformation, efforts to control media in foreign countries, use of front organizations and other proxies, blackmail, personal and economic, and political influence operations. Those examples of Soviet-era tradecraft still resonate with us today. As our Baltic friends explained, what is new is the transition to digital and online communication and Russia's relentless efforts to sow division by exploiting these new social media platforms. During the Cold War, the Reagan administration established the Active Measures Working Group, an interagency body consisting of the old U.S. Information Agency, CIA, FBI, State Department, and several elements of the Department of Defense. As one study has noted, quote, the purpose of this group was to respond comprehensively to disinformation, to define it, to create institutions to tackle it, and to draw attention to it at the highest level. I raise this perspective because the U.S. and our European friends are the targets of a ruthless adversary in the Russian bear, one bent on suborning our democracies and undermining our historic transatlantic alliance. That cannot be disputed. Perhaps a similar interagency effort and strategic communication strategy is required today if we are to successfully combat the Kremlin's influence and disinformation campaigns, both here in the U.S. and abroad. While our subcommittee focuses on the funding of what must be a broader national strategy, I welcome a discussion on these and related matters. Lastly, Madam Chair, there are numerous adversaries that require our time and attention. When it comes to countering disinformation and malign influence, but this subcommittee felt it was important to focus on Russia. The countries and regions facing attacks and other forms of aggression from the Kremlin remain one of our top priorities. We've included funding and policies in our annual appropriations bills on a bipartisan basis to demonstrate this, and we want to continue to provide you with the tools and resources that you need to ensure the U.S. is doing everything it can to shore up our allies and partners in combating Russian aggressions in all its forms. We look forward to hearing your thoughts today, and I yield back.
Thank you. After the panel presents their testimony, I will call on members based on seniority of those members present when the hearing was called to order, and I will alternate between majority and minority. We will be doing 2 panels today, and I want to ensure all members have an opportunity to question all the witnesses. Therefore, each member is asked to keep their questions to within 4 minutes per round, which includes the response from our witnesses. Mr. Lansing, Ms. Gabrielle, Mr. Kulikowski, we will be happy to place your full testimonies into the record. If you would be kind enough to summarize your oral statement, I want to make sure we have enough time to get to everyone's questions. Mr. Lansing, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the efforts of the U.S. Agency for Global Media to counter Russian disinformation. USAGM is an independent agency that provides accurate, objective, and professional news and information to parts of the world that do not have the benefit of a free and open press. We accelerate that mission through the work of our 5 networks: the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. Our programs reach a measured, unduplicated audience of 345 million people on a weekly basis in more than 100 countries in 61 languages, on a wide range of all broadcast and digital platforms. Your hearing today could not have come at a better time. We're living through an explosion of disinformation, lies, and distortion spread by those very same authoritarian regimes that our networks report on. The weaponization of information that we're seeing is real, and the Kremlin is one of the primary aggressors on this front. Based on my observations, Russia's goal is to destroy the very idea of an objective, verifiable set of facts. From their perspective, in a world where nothing is empirically truthful, any lie will do. And if everything's a lie, the biggest liar wins. It's not an understatement to say that the information battlefield may be the fight of the 21st century. While the Kremlin seeks to control information, our journalists are on the front lines, often risking everything to shine a light on the truth. Those efforts create security concerns for our journalists and increasingly dangerous operating environments for our USAGM personnel. Nevertheless, we're meeting the challenge head-on. We reach Russian-speaking audiences through direct programming and expanded distribution of our new 24/7 Russian-language digital and TV network known as Current Time. Current Time is a play on words. The most famous media brand in Russia, in Russian, is known as Time, and Current Time would be, in the US, would be like saying 60 Minutes or the real 60 Minutes. So Current Time is like the real news to Russian speakers. I'm proud to share with you the incredible arc of success we're seeing with our groundbreaking network, which launched in 2017 thanks to your support. Current Time's aim is to reach Russian speakers anywhere in the world, not just within the boundaries of Russia, and to engage younger, savvy audiences with a heavy emphasis on digital and social media content so that they can share it with people within the Russian Federation. The network covers social, economic, and political issues that the state media ignores, such as protests, and challenges Russian viewers to form their own opinions. Our impact in Russia is clear. Due to Russian restrictions on broadcasting inside the country, Current Time operates with a fresh, digital-first, cross-platform strategy to reach around the broadcasting platforms not available to us in Russia. Of Current Time's 520 million video views, that's right, 520 million video views on social media last year, more than half came from within the Russian Federation. That wasn't true 2 years ago. But we're aiming higher than that with our global distribution strategy. When Russian speakers anywhere in the world tune into Current Time, here is what they might see.
In a complicated world, it can be difficult to tell what's real, but Current Time tells it like it is. It's television for Russian speakers worldwide, delivering news our viewers care about, information that stands up to scrutiny. Current Time brings together top journalists from throughout the Russian-speaking world, delivering a fresh alternative to Kremlin-controlled media. With headquarters in Prague and Washington, and more than 100 reporters on the ground in Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, the Baltics, the United States, and Europe, Current Time serves as a reality check with no fake news or spin. Current Time is on the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with news shows for our European and Central Asian audiences, top-of-the-hour headlines, a daily news digest from Washington and New York, a nightly political talk show, weekend wrap-ups from Washington and Prague, and a weekly analysis, See Both Sides, that helps viewers tell fact from fiction. Available through cable, satellite, IPTV, and online streaming, Current Time reaches a potential audience of 240 million Russian speakers across the globe. And Current Time isn't just TV. In 2018, its digital platforms drew more than 520 million online views, with more than half coming from inside Russia. This is Current Time's mission. Real news, real people, in real time. That's Current Time TV.
These efforts are part of our strategic focus on global language-based programming rather than limiting ourselves to national boundaries. We launched a similar effort in Farsi earlier this year, and we're currently developing a similar network 24/7 in Mandarin that we hope to launch in the spring of 2020. In addition, VOA and RFERL jointly lead two highly impactful fact-checking websites known as Polygraph.com in English and Factograph in Russian. The sites evaluate Kremlin-controlled disinformation on an hourly basis and immediately separate facts from fiction, adding context and debunking lies. Now, looking to the future, USAGM will continue to prioritize Russian language broadcasting and programming in other languages that will combat the Kremlin's sustained disinformation campaigns. Our work is providing an alternative to the false narratives and manipulated information disseminated by a regime that blocks a free press and is afraid of the truth. We provide journalism based on fact, balanced in perspective, and adhere to professional journalistic standards. This is something that Russians living in Russia rarely see if it weren't for the USAGM. Journalism that reflects the values of our society, freedom, democracy, and hope. This is a core tenet for us, honest and truthful journalism as a catalyst for change, and it represents our best weapon on the information battlefield. All of us at USAGM are passionate and committed to ensuring that the global work we do delivers on our mission for the United States government and the American people. We cannot do this without the support of Congress, and we're particularly thankful to this committee and the Appropriations Committee in general, Mrs. Lowy. We're grateful for your support of our work, and we value your oversight role and your advice here today. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking Member Rogers, thank you for inviting me to testify before your subcommittee about the Global Engagement Center's work to coordinate efforts of the federal government to counter Russian disinformation. This is an important topic, and I very much appreciate that you've devoted this time to this issue. I'm pleased to be joined here today with Coordinator Kulikowski and CEO Lansing. The various work of our organizations complement one another, and I think it's important that by testifying together, we can paint a better picture of the work that's being done to expose and to counter Russian disinformation. The GEC's mission, as defined by Congress, is to direct, lead, synchronize, integrate, and coordinate efforts of the federal government to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign state and foreign non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining or influencing the policies, security, or stability of the United States and United States allies and partner nations. Secretary Pompeo has called upon the GEC to employ a broad suite of tools to stop America's adversaries from weaponizing information and using propaganda to undermine free societies. It is clear that the Kremlin has been attempting to damage America's credibility among our allies and our partners, undermine transatlantic unity, and to sow discord in target societies and weaken Western institutions and governments. Russia attacks those it perceives as adversaries by overwhelming target audiences with lies, questioning the very concept of objective truth, and increasing polarization in societies. Russia has been aggressively deploying propaganda and disinformation since early in the Soviet era, but new information technologies allow it to cause harm on a much larger scale than ever before. Now, as then, free societies must unite, and we must work diligently together to build public awareness, to promote resilience, and ultimately to defeat this threat to our values and to our institutions. The GEC is actively working with our allies and our partners in Europe to identify, recognize, and expose Russian disinformation, and to promote accurate messages about the United States and our allies and our partners in the pursuit of freedom, prosperity, and security. We are also an active participant in the Russia Influence Group, which is co-chaired by the commander of U.S. European Command and the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of European and Eurasia Affairs at the Department of State. This interagency body has been coordinating the lines of efforts of the U.S. government agencies to counter the various aspects of Russian malign influence in Europe for almost 4 years. The GEC has funded specific initiatives to counter Russian disinformation, and these include deploying technology to provide early warnings of foreign disinformation, analyzing which foreign audiences are most susceptible to targeted disinformation, developing partnerships with key local messengers to produce content to reach critical audiences, building the technical skills of civil society, organizations, NGOs, and journalists to shed light on the spread of disinformation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We appreciate this subcommittee's support for the GEC's mission, the attention to this subject, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you. Mr. Kulikowski.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking Member Rogers. Thank you for your kind words, members of the subcommittee, for this opportunity to discuss our role in countering Russian disinformation. The Office of the Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia's historic efforts over 30 years to build free and democratic partners among states transitioning from communism are now focused on the central obstacle to this transition, Russian malign influence, including their use of disinformation. Of the $1.5 billion in fiscal year 2017 foreign assistance funds we coordinated in the region, we allocated over $103 million to support independent media programming, including $56 million in supplemental funding to help build resilience against Russian disinformation. Of the $1.3 billion in 2018 funds, we have allocated thus far $54 million to support this media sector work. We use these funds to build resilience against Russian disinformation for 4 kinds of programs. First, media literacy, programs that teach producers and audiences of all ages how to separate fact from fiction. For example, in Montenegro, the Embassy Public Affairs section funded a digital forensic center that uncovered evidence of Russian involvement in a local protest designed to stoke ethnic tensions to destabilize Montenegro, and their work discredited the effort. Second, access to independent media and reliable content for local audiences. This helps shed light on all the levers of Russian malign influence. In Moldova, for example, a USAID-supported virtual newsroom exposed 700-plus Facebook accounts spreading disinformation in advance of the February parliamentary elections. In Ukraine, NED is using our funding to support the two most popular online sources of objective information in Ukraine's Donbas region. Third, improving the professionalism, management, and financial sustainability of media outlets. For example, USAID's Balkan Media Assistance Program helped increase the online advertising revenue of one outlet nearly 500% and the audience traffic of another 113%. Likewise, state is now bringing Central Asian journalists to the United States to develop their professional skills. And fourth, we support strategic communications analysis to determine vulnerabilities and specific action needed. DRL, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau of the State Department, for instance, uses our funds to support research on the characteristics of audiences in the Baltics and the Balkans to help decision makers determine how best to raise awareness about disinformation, research that is also being used by the European Parliament. Madam Chair, our work to build resilience to Russian disinformation across the Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia region builds on the work of U.S. government partners across the interagency. Each partner brings its own comparative advantage to the table to complement our programs. Our collaboration will help us reach our common goal of countering this disinformation that is central to Russia's efforts to exert malign influence over each of the countries in which ACE works. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to begin the questioning, and we will go from Democrat to Republican in the order in which you have arrived. This is a question for the whole panel. I see little evidence that we are successful in using all our tools of public diplomacy to get our message out and win the hearts and minds. And I really question, even though we saw this beautiful commercial, if we are effectively, how do we evaluate? Are we effective in connecting the much larger operations and assets of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the Department of State, the agencies of the United States government to assist in our efforts to counter state-sponsored disinformation or the terrorist narrative? We have, in the United States, the best technology and marketing minds in the world. Are we harnessing these talents in this important area? Are we using all the platforms of the United States government to counter the messages of ISIS and other terrorists? How do we redirect the conversation and better contest the digital information space? I mean, when you look, many of us have visited many countries, spoken to many leaders. We're not doing so well in these elections. So if you can address the last, why don't we begin with Mr. Lansing, address the last question. Are we really using advanced digital information space?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman Lowy. It's the right question. And in the 4 years that I've been leading USAGM, we've had a dramatic shift away from, not turning away from, but towards digital platforms, where in the past our primary method for reaching audiences was through, frankly, shortwave radio and AM and FM radio and some television. Well, our most recent efforts, including the Current Time network that we just discussed, are all digital first. And the primary method for reaching audiences with that network is on social media platforms, on mobile platforms, and on other digital platforms. As I mentioned in my prepared testimony, we're reaching 540 million video views on social media platforms. That's short-form videos that are traveling on social media platforms to the former Soviet space and within the Russian Federation. And our key is finding not just anybody, not just Russians generically, but young, savvy future leaders, people who will influence others and influencers. And we're measuring our work not just by reach, media reach. While reach is important, you can't influence anybody until you reach them, but we're holding ourselves accountable to you and this committee based on our impact. And so we have measurements of impact that we measure every day against our media. And what are those measurements of impact? Do people find our information trustworthy? Do they share it? Do they like it? Do they do something with the information as a result of having it have reached them? And I can tell you that in Iran, for example, I know we're here to talk about Russia, but in Iran, our trustworthiness is measured at 85%, and we're reaching fully a quarter of all Iranians within Iran with our content on Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. But generally, across the globe, all of our content, on average, has a trustworthy factor of 75%. And so the one thing that we're exporting beyond a particular message or journalism or platform is the fact that it's believable. And in a world where you can't believe anything, to be able to reach people and have them believe it is truthful is really our #1 export.
I'm going to turn to Ms. Gabrielle, but I'd be interested, do you poll on a regular basis?
Yes, ma'am, we do. We use Gallup and other third-party, just as U.S. media does, and we poll around the world.
And the elections throughout Europe reflect all this outstanding media, is that correct?
As far as I know.
Ms. Gabrielle.
Yes, ma'am. Well, first of all, I appreciate your thoughts behind all the different unique capabilities that we have, not just in the United States, but really across the world in terms of our allies. You know, our adversaries, like Russia, they have weak alliances that are based on convenience, whereas the United States has true friendships that are based on trust. And that is because of the principles that we promote. So leveraging those alliances and leveraging those relationships and leveraging that trust is key. The GEC was essentially formed to answer the call specifically that you're asking about in terms of bringing all the different capabilities and technologies to bear. So we have 4 key priorities at the GEC that's leading our U.S. government efforts to counter propaganda and disinformation. There's so much good work being done in this field across the U.S. government, but if there's not a body that is coordinating those efforts, then we're going to be duplicating and we're not going to be supporting each other's efforts in the best way possible. Some of those efforts are in a classified space, some of them are in an open space. So the GEC is building essentially a mission center that can coordinate all of these efforts. And within our mission center, we're building the expertise. We're bringing in data scientists. We have people who used to work in advertising. We have experts in languages and in regional expertise. We have people who are influence experts, who are information operations experts, so that we can essentially be not just the mission center, but the center of expertise across the U.S. government's efforts in countering propaganda and disinformation. Our second line of effort is working with our international partners. Our international partners, as I said before, these are true alliances based on trust, and they share information with us, and we can share best practices and make sure that we're all working together to defeat the adversaries who want to use our basic vulnerability of our desire to communicate against us. They want to use our basic freedoms, the principles that make us great. They want to use those as weaknesses. So we work with our allies to prevent that. Our third line of effort right now is leveraging all of the wonderful work that's being done in the private sector, the civil society and tech companies, the tech industry, as well as the media, bringing all of those efforts to bear because there is so much work being done to counter propaganda and disinformation. It would be a huge mistake not to bring that together. And finally, we have to continue to assess and adjust as we go along. So this is something we're working on. The GEC received its mandate to counter state-sponsored disinformation a couple of years ago. We're building this effort, and I think that this is something that will ultimately bring us together so that we can make sure we are not duplicating efforts and we can make sure that we are bringing these efforts to bear in the best way possible.
Thank you, Mr. Kulikowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So our efforts, as I said, are based on building resilience. So we don't put out messages. We teach people within each country how to respond, how to react to the messages they receive. So, for instance, In Ukraine, the Learn to Discern program brings in people of all ages to teach them how to discern reality from falsity, and has been used successfully in the elections leading up to the presidential elections. And that teaching is not only teaching them how to discern reality, but teaching them how to be responsible content creators so that they can become the messengers of truth, if you will, and put it out on the net. The evidence is that those efforts are being successful and are being adopted by Ukraine to be spread throughout the entire educational system. So by creating users who know both how to discern reality and how to project true reality, we build the resilience that no matter how large the effort is that Russia is putting out there, that the audience is not receptive to it and is able to respond on their own. Thank you.
Thank you. I know my colleagues will pursue these issues, so I'll turn this over to Mr. Rogers, although it's tempting just to keep going. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Kulikowski, there's a multiplicity of U.S. government actors involved in countering Russian disinformation. It's unclear to me at present how well coordinated these efforts are. A recent study by the RAND Corporation, for example, said that a wide list of agency responsibilities suggests the absence of a clear overall lead agency to coordinate U.S. government activities to respond to the Russians. There's the State Department has their Global Engagement Center. State has, of course, the Bureau for European and Eurasian Affairs, U.S. Government Interagency Working Group, the Russian Influence Group, RIG, includes a lot of different agencies from DOD, State, DHS, and so on. Help me ring a bell here.
Happy to, Mr. Rogers. So the coordination is overall, with respect to Russian malign influence is my job, is the job of my office, my bureau. We coordinate through the agencies that you mentioned, and in fact, each of those does something slightly different and has different authorities and ways to work. So we work with USAID, we provide we coordinate on getting funding to them, and USAID works primarily on a development model, which is a program to develop capabilities and capacities over 5 years. The public diplomacy section in state works on a much shorter time frame, and each embassy has its public diplomacy section that can take short-term projects and respond to immediate needs with agility to provide responses to issues as they come up. Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, another bureau in the State Department, has the ability to reach into countries that we who work primarily with those right on the border with Russia do not have the ability to reach into. The GEC has the ability to do messaging and other things that we don't have the authority to do. So there is a reason why these different agencies are involved in the effort. They each do different things, and it's really our job, my job, to help coordinate those efforts and make sure they fit into a coherent pattern, which we do on an annual basis, planning out the program of operation with the money that we have for each country.
How can we know that you're succeeding? I know you'll tell us, but...
Thank you. In terms of, obviously, we do evaluations. The evaluations are being put into place. We have short-term indications of the effectiveness of each of those programs. We measure them. to show that they are accomplishing their tasks. I guess maybe you have to look at some of the bigger issues. You have to look at the results in North Macedonia, for instance, where a massive effort was put into place by Russia to make sure that the agreement was not accepted by either country. And that through the combined efforts of all these agencies that we've talked about, we successfully battled that back, and the people of North Macedonia and Greece gave us a huge victory, which is really an example that leads the rest of the West Balkans forward and gives them hope. So that's maybe not quite the answer you were looking for, but in terms of results, the Ukraine elections is another one where the efforts of Russia to disrupt the presidential elections did not work. At the 30,000-foot level, at least, there are many instances that indicate that these combined efforts are in fact succeeding against the huge effort Russia puts in to disrupt. That's not to say the war is won. That's to say we're winning battles as we go. Thank you.
My time has expired.
Thank you. Actually, if I may take the liberty of following up with my good friend, Mr. Rogers, on the coordination, can you just address the Global Engagement Center, DOD's Joint Web Ops Center? Is this new DOD center performing duplicative functions? Are they doing a better job? Are they coordinating with you? If you can just describe this, I would be most appreciative.
I'll do my best, Madam Chair. There are mechanisms in place to coordinate with DOD and with DOD centers. There are two mechanisms at the State Department, as Ms. Gabrielle explained. There's the Russia Influence Group, which coordinates, which is jointly chaired by DOD and State, and coordinates with all the actors throughout the spectrum of malign influence activities. There is also, with European Command, EUCOM, there is also a joint effort with State. State is a deputy commander of EUCOM, and there is we were just there 2 months ago for a conference among all of the State Department heads of mission and all of EUCOM staff to coordinate our efforts, and this is an ongoing effort. So there are mechanisms. Some of these, some of the units that you referred to are fairly new. We're learning how to work with them, but the effort is underway, and that's part. And 5 months into the job, I'm trying to get there as quickly as I can. But the mechanisms and the structures are there to do it.
Well, I'm going to turn to Ms. Lee, but you look like you're so anxious to address this. Am I correct?
Thank you very much. I would appreciate the opportunity to address it. A couple of things. You mentioned the Joint MESO Web Ops Center. I led a delegation from the State Department to visit because we will be playing a major role in coordinating the efforts of the Web Ops Center. So I led the state.
Where is the Web Ops Center?
It's in Tampa. It's co-located with SOCOM currently. So I led this delegation so that we could bring regional bureaus and membership from the regional bureaus to go and see what this is all about. Ultimately, they're building a very strong messaging capability. So the GEC's role, as I've mentioned before, is to lead the U.S. government's effort and to coordinate our efforts in countering propaganda and disinformation. Not all malign efforts, not all malign influence, but those specific. So as we build this mission center, we're building the expertise so that the interagency can know that we're the place to come when you need expertise on countering propaganda and disinformation, and also so we can lead those efforts. But we're new. In the past 2 years, we have this state-sponsored disinformation mission. The Russia Influence Group and others were 2 years ahead of us in their build. So a lot of places in the U.S. government, coordination had already started and been led. So our objective is to get involved in that coordination, show that we have the expertise, and then take the load off of the different organizations who are focused on their specific efforts so that we can do that coordination as we go. So Russia Influence Group is a good example, how the GEC will be doing coordination and assisting with the DoD Joint Web Ops Center. We're not focused on messaging at the GEC. We're focused on the strategic efforts to counter propaganda and disinformation. Words are not message, our words are not influence. Words are just words. We're working on influence and coordinating the efforts of the U.S. government to counter disinformation and propaganda using influence. Thank you.
I am pleased to turn to Ms. Lee and save other questions for later.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our chairwoman and ranking member for holding this very important hearing today. I'm very familiar, I think most of us, with state-sponsored disinformation in our own campaigns here in America. It's well documented that Russia, for example, tried to influence and turn African-American groups against each other through their interference in our elections. Russians' interference, of course, was very clear in terms of which candidate they supported for the presidency. So we're very clear on what is taking place. I've been a longstanding member of this subcommittee, and I've long had concerns over the effectiveness of some of the programs run by U.S. Agency for Global Media, including the Office of Cuba Broadcasting and Radio and TV Marti, which serves, quite frankly, no useful purpose. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars, and it actually should be defunded. I'm also concerned about recent reports that a project called Iran Disinformation Project, which was funded by Global Engagement Center, was attacking U.S. persons, human rights advocates, and journalists and academics on Twitter, including formerly imprisoned Washington Post journalist Jason Rezaian. So, Special Envoy Gabrielle, as you know, the Global Engagement Center's approach is to work through credible partners to counter state propaganda, which you've laid out. Yet the selection of Iran disinfo and their attacking online of U.S. persons raises serious concerns about GEC's vetting and oversight processes. I'm also gravely concerned that Iran disinfo also tweeted out patently partisan opposition to the Iran nuclear deal, which has nothing to do with countering state-sponsored propaganda. So what steps have you taken to ensure stronger oversight and accountability over grantees, and what safeguards are in place to ensure that GEC-funded programs do not violate U.S. values or norms and that are nonpartisan and not opposing any specific policy that this administration just happens to oppose, such as the Iran deal?
Thank you so much for bringing up this important topic. There's actually a lot of misinformation out there, and I say mis because I don't think it's intentional, about what happened with the Iran disinformation project. Essentially, the GEC does find third-party partners to work with, because the idea is to create force multipliers, right, to be able to spread truthful narratives using third-party implementers. That was the intent of that project. The intent was for it to unveil Iranian disinformation. The GEC learned that someone had tweeted a few tweets on a Twitter handle associated with that implementer that were not in the conduct that was intended. They were outside the scope of the agreement that we had with this implementer. I immediately suspended this within hours of learning that there were several tweets that were outside the scope of our agreement. I immediately suspended it, and we conducted a thorough review. We have since terminated our agreement with that implementer. Never the intent of the Global Engagement Center to have anyone tweeting at U.S. citizens. And I just have to add, because you mentioned Jason Rezaian, I am a former journalist myself. I was reporting on his situation. I was saddened by it. I was concerned for him, and I'm very happy that he made it home safely.
What accountability measures, though, have you put in place to make sure that this does not happen again? And also, the partisan nature of what you're doing in terms of the messages. How do you ensure that, for instance, one of your partners does not tweet out or support a policy of the Trump administration, in opposition to the Iran deal? That's very undemocratic.
Again, this has to be a nonpartisan issue, and us coordinating efforts to counter propaganda and disinformation has to be nonpartisan because our adversaries want to create divisions among us to separate us. So I completely agree with you that this has to be nonpartisan going forward, and we are a nonpartisan organization. As far as the use of freedom of expression by our implementers, that's not something we can control, but what we can do is put mechanisms in place so that we're aware of what's happening, and if they go outside the scope, we can more quickly realize it, assess it, and terminate those agreements.
You've got to do it in advance. You've got to put some accountability measures in before they actually sign the contract.
Completely
And then you've
agree.
got to make sure that there's some oversight and transparency during the process or during the time frame of their contract.
We absolutely agree with you. And in fact, we are tightening up the scope of agreement in agreements like this to lay out specific requirements. We are also putting oversight mechanisms in place. My team's conducted a thorough review of our other similar mechanisms so that we can assess them and be better about recognizing earlier. Again, if someone tweets a few tweets, those things happen fast and the damage is done very quickly. I couldn't agree more with you that we need our implementers to stay within the scope of our agreements because this has to be a nonpartisan issue. This is a national security issue, and we have to work together as a country.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me, first of all, express my appreciation for you holding this hearing. I think this is very important. I've worried for some time that our government media outreach initiatives were in serious need of replenishment and regeneration. And frankly, I'm inspired by your presentations. Obviously, you all embrace this with a great passion, and you're looking at the tools of the modern media economy to better leverage successful outcomes here. In that regard, let me ask you, Mr. Lansing, you have a measurement of 520 million views that you put out. Each week I get a report where my own tweets and my own Facebooks, how many people have looked at them. And by the time you start adding that up, you know, you're in the tens of thousands of people. I mean, 2,000 might look at this one. Sometimes one breaks and it's 20 or 30,000. And so that adds up and piles up quite a bit. So I get what you're trying to say with 520 million views, but going back to what you said, measurement of impact, is that really an accurate number? There are other ways in which you can determine impact, and I think we ought to unpack that. I have several other questions, so if I cut you off, it's just going to try to get to a whole spectrum of things. So if you could give me some assessment of that question.
No, that's a great question, Congressman Fortenberry. We hold ourselves accountable, as I said earlier, to impact over reach. The reach is measurable because it's social media platforms and they report their analytics, and so that makes it much even easier for us to understand the reach versus broadcast media. But we don't really think reach is the primary measurement for us. It's really, what do people do having received our content? Do they share it? Do they like it? Do they take some aggressive or non-aggressive or civic action as a result of it? We measure all that through qualitative research that we do in the field. The most important measurement in my mind, honestly—
What does that mean, polling?
Polling, yeah, just like in the United States. I came out of the private sector as well. It's Gallup and other polling companies that do interviews by phone and in person.
Okay, good. And I think this is a softer place, a softer science. It's harder. Sometimes we in Congress, we look at how much money we're spending and how good our intention is, and we determine that that's a measurable outcome, that it's effective, and that's not necessarily the case. So that's one of the areas that obviously we need to do work on. You're clearly skilled at that. Secondly, though, how does our effort compare to Russia's, for instance? Now, there's different intentionality, and I don't want to say our intentionality is the same at all. There's different intentionality. But in terms of the actual outreach efforts, by what measure can you compare us to what Russia is doing?
Well, I don't know exactly what they invest in RT and in Sputnik and in other Russian media, but I know that it's more than what the United States government invests. Of course, all media in Russian is—
10 times, 100 times?
I think it's around a 10x factor, absolutely.
Okay. Back to the question that both our Ranking Member Rogers and Ms. Lowy also raised, our chair. How can you assure us that in, for instance, your use of partners to leverage outcome, that isn't a force multiplier, that may be a force multiplier, or it may be indicators of fragmentation. Again, until you've come along, my impression is of this whole entire government effort that it is very fragmented, and that, again, it was in serious need of replenishment and updating. So explain how your work and perhaps Jim and Ms. Lansing, your work all go together, or I should say Mr. K, sorry, as we used to call you when you worked around here. Explain that a little bit clearer, because it seems like there are a whole of government approach going on here or a fragmented approach going on here.
Coordination is certainly one of the biggest challenges across any number of institutions. So it is a very difficult job, as I'm sure you're aware. But that is our primary focus, is doing that coordination piece. So we have looked at best practices at the Global Engagement Center and building a strategy for how we can conduct coordination across the government. And since our mission is global, we have to focus on every threat of disinformation and propaganda, and globally how that's applied. So we're building an interagency and international coordination cell based on best practices that we've seen in doing coordination.
Where, at the State Department?
So again, yes, at the State Department. Now, let me clarify. There is some confusion because the GEC is at the State Department, but our mandate is the whole of government coordination, not just within the State Department. So one of the first things I had my team do when I came on board is build a slide for me to show us who are we supposed to be coordinating.
Okay, so you have a map of this. I think we need to see the map of this. I think my time's up.
I'm happy to share with you our diagram.
You can, I get it.
I call it my spaghetti diagram because essentially we're coordinating the entire world of countering propaganda and disinformation, but we are using best practices to do it. It takes some time. And as Mr. Kulikowski was saying, you know, it's not a matter of who's in the lead for what specific objective. It's a matter of us making sure we're working together and deciding who's leading.
Okay.
And for us, it's coordinating those
I get it. I've
efforts.
oversimplified it. I'm just calling. You've laid down a mapping strategy. Madam Chair, I think that would be important for the committee to see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Ms. May.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member, for holding today's important hearing. I wanted to ask Mr. Lansing, I know today's hearing is about American efforts to combat Russian disinformation campaigns, but I wanted to address and to hear about concerns over USAGM's management that have risen again in the past few days in the news. The credibility and transparency of USAGM is critical to ensure that we are able to provide a counterbalance to the corruption in many of the countries where your programming is being broadcast. Can you please address for us your plans and assure us how you are fortifying these safeguards at USAGM that ensure that your reporters are providing accurate and unbiased news to viewers, and also oversight in relation to financial management, for example?
Sure, thank you for that question. So we have redoubled our efforts at program review, meaning that we, with all of our networks and all of our content, we broadcast, as I said earlier, in 61 languages to over 100 countries, 24/7. And so we have a rolling process that each of the 5 networks reviews its content on a rolling basis that is already been broadcast, reviews it for professionalism, for accuracy, for discipline and adherence to the highest standards of professional journalism. And all of those reports, all of those reviews roll up to me to review on a regular basis. We've redoubled our effort in that. We've added more resources to even add more people so that we can do that on a more consistent basis. The most important thing that we have, Congresswoman Meng, is our credibility. That's what we're actually exporting to the world, is honesty and credibility and professional journalism. And we hold ourselves to the highest standards of professional journalism in our review process, in our editorial development process. It's something that I've done my whole professional career. We have an excellent team of people leading our networks. Amanda Bennett leads the Voice of America, a twice Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Ambassador Alberto Fernandez leading MBN has really, in the last year and a half, reshaped the entire Arabic strategy for our business. Radio Free Europe launched Current Time and has completely rebuilt and created our Russian media strategy. And I can go on and on. So
Actually, so sorry to cut.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, you've increased your resources, personnel, I assume. Do you know how many there are? What's the number of the increase, and how often do they undergo this kind of review?
it's a rolling review. It happens constantly as we roll forward. Each network is of a different size. Voice of America has 43 language services. Radio Free Europe has 21 language services. MBN has one language. It's in Arabic. We have a Latin America division within Voice of America. So each one is tailored to that particular network. So there are many more people at Voice of America doing program review, for example, than say at Middle East Broadcasting Networks, as there are just more languages to review.
What about TV Marti, for example?
TV Marti, we are currently undergoing a complete bottom-to-top review of all of its editorial processes. We put together a panel of 5 Spanish-speaking journalism professors to review the content of OCB over the last several months. They put a report together for me that indicated there were serious lapses in the professional journalism, the professionalism of the journalism at OCB. And as a result, I have taken actions to remove several people from OCB, and we're currently reviewing the entire management structure of OCB and the mission of OCB, and we are in the process right now of evaluating what steps we'll be taking to strengthen and fortify the content and journalism coming out of OCB.
Okay. Will you be able to report back as you are making improvements, increasing resources, some of these improvements that you might have made to our committee?
I absolutely will.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Ms. Roby.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the panelists for being here this morning for this very important hearing. And I thank the chairwoman and the ranking member for holding it. And I too, along with my colleagues, as you've heard, share the concern about this coordination across government agencies. And I think, Mr. Kulikowski, we talked about, or you mentioned in response to one of the questions about reporting annually. And I'd just like to start and say, I wonder if there's an opportunity maybe for you to revisit with this committee a little bit more often than just annually, with some updated information as to how that those coordination efforts, because again, I think that there's an overlying concern here about those coordination efforts. So to the extent that the chairwoman would also agree, I think it would be beneficial for this committee to hear more than just waiting for a full calendar year or fiscal year before we hear back from you. But my specific question is for you, Special Envoy Gabrielle. I understand that GEC has developed, as in your testimony, your own counter-Kremlin strategy. And I'd like to know, specifically referring to, as you said in your testimony, analyze, build, and communicate this model. So what does that mean? What accountability measures are in place? If you could drill down on that. I guess, in other words, how do you know that the strategy has been effective? And again, this goes back to these overlying concerns about, what is the metrics by which we're grading success with all of these efforts?
So as I mentioned before, the GEC's counter-state sponsored disinformation mission is still relatively new. So we received our first dollars, our first funding for this about a year ago. So we're building into all of our programs and all our initiatives measurements and evaluation techniques. We actually have brought on a team that can establish at the beginning of each initiative what some of those points are that should be evaluated as we go along. I think that that's key, having almost somebody from the outside, but that's within the organization, hired specifically to be looking at that and helping us identify measurements of success. Because evaluating how well you've influenced someone or a target audience is not easy to do unless you have a specific marker on the board when you start out. I think a good example is our support, which we worked with Mr. Kulikowski's organization on the, worked with the North Macedonian government to help ensure a free and fair vote in the lead up to the September 30th naming referendum. We actually provided people on the ground there to support with insights reports, giving demographic and micro-targeting information, really using data scientists to support that effort. That's a good example where at the beginning you want to know, here's the marker. If people are getting out and voting, and if that's the measurement of success, well, then that's something that's easily measurable. Identifying how well someone's been influenced is more difficult, but we are putting mechanisms in place. That's just one example. You asked about the ABCs. So what that really means, and thank you for reading this, is we first begin with analyzing. We have to analyze what the tactics are that are being used against us by our adversaries, really understanding them and understanding what the target populations are and whether or not our adversaries are being effective. Because if they're not, then we're not going to put our efforts there. But analyzing the target audiences and understanding how they're being targeted. The second is really building the capability and the capacity of foreign partners to be able to identify disinformation and to be able to respond quickly to it. Right now, we've got a number of international initiatives, including working with foreign governments and then on the ground working with civil society actors in that. And the third is really communicate. The C of the ABC is communicate. Russian disinformation takes advantage of vacuums of information. So with our partners, we fill that information space with, as directed by Congress, fact-based narratives.
And just real quickly, have you been able, using that model, have you been able to identify areas of the world that are most vulnerable to malign information attacks?
Yes, we certainly have, and I think that for the purposes of this committee, we're talking about Russia and where Russia is effective. We know that Russia specifically targets the U.S. And there was a question earlier about, how much effort does Russia put at this? Well, the United States, we have to look at the entire world, whereas Russia very much focuses its adversarial behavior on the U.S. So we are constantly using data scientists, data analysis to identify what are the most vulnerable audiences and where we should focus our efforts. And that's part of our coordination piece as the interagency looks to us to be the experts in countering propaganda and disinformation. That data science is key in helping them understand where those efforts should go.
Well, I appreciate it. I've gone over my time, Madam Chair, but I do think that there are some good follow-up questions here as this is being laid out for us in terms of being able to measure the success, not only from state on reporting how the impact of the coordination of these government agencies, but also as more information becomes available, that this committee be made abreast of what's going on and the successes and the challenges that you're facing moving forward. I think that would be very helpful. So thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Mr. Price, but at another time, and maybe a follow-up question. When you said Russia primarily targets the United States, it's hard for me to believe that they aren't very involved in elections all throughout Europe and another place of the world. But I'll turn to Mr. Price now, so you can save that for another time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Kulikowski, I want to welcome you back to the committee, and particularly thank you for raising the issue of the disinformation efforts underway in the former Soviet states and in the former communist states of Central and Eastern Europe. You mentioned Montenegro and Moldova, both notorious cases, and I assume there are more where those came from. And of course, Mr. Lansing, your outlets are broadcasting in most, if not all, of these places, and also, Ms. Gabrielle, if you want to chime in on the question I'm about to ask, you're welcome to do so as well. I'm interested in what patterns you're seeing in terms of Russian efforts in these countries. I know that's a broad question. What kind of generalizations can you make? And I'm particularly concerned about the kind of democratic backsliding we've seen in many of these countries. Many are fragile democracies to start with, and then others that we had thought were joining the Western community of nations have backslid in some pretty alarming ways. I wondered how that has changed Russia's approach and your approach to countering Russian influence. I suppose there are a number of things one could ask. How has this democratic backsliding made it easier for Russia to interfere, or has it altered the character of that interference? In terms of the local outlets that you champion, Mr. Kulikowski, that you try to empower, what kind of threats and dilemmas and problems has this posed for them, these developments in their own countries? And then how do we cover it? How do we deal with this? Let me just take Hungary as a case study. How do we describe it when President Trump welcomes Viktor Orban to the Oval Office? Do we cover the Republican and Democratic senators when they warn him not to do this? Do we, in our broadcasts, indicate how controversial this is in our own country? And certainly how it relates to what is widely perceived as democratic backsliding in Hungary. Oh, I would love to see transcripts of our coverage of that Orban visit to the Oval Office. If they're available, I think that would be very useful. I think this would be a pretty interesting case study. But you see the kind of issues this raises, and I wonder, maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Lansing, as to how we deal with it.
Thank you for the question, Congressman Price. We will absolutely provide you transcripts of our coverage of anything, but particularly of the visit of Orban to the White House. Our role is to, through Voice of America, is to cover America for the world, and we do it in a professional, unbiased, journalistic manner. We don't carry a particular point of view, Republican or Democratic, or the administration. Our point of view is to give both sides of, or all sides of any particular story, and report that in parts of the world that don't have a free media. I will tell you, it was a multifaceted question. One point I wanted to make, you asked, how are the Russians influencing parts of the world where we're seeing backsliding in democratic institutions? Well, we're seeing that more and more, as you know, in even NATO countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Hungary. And so just this year, we expanded Radio Free Europe's coverage into Romanian, and Bulgaria, so that we're there now present where we weren't before because it had become more democratic. And now that it's backslid, we're in there now confronting Russian disinformation and lies with truthful and factual information. We're also, at this very moment, exploring an expansion into Hungary as well for the same reason. One of the things I thought the committee might find interesting, and I'm sure you're already aware of it, that while we saw the malign interest in our 2016 election was done by, warehouses full of Russian trolls and robots even, what we're seeing now is it's stepping up into artificial intelligence. And so the Russians are using AI to create information, to create personalities, to create actual people that don't really exist as a means of communicating and disrupting societies, democratic societies, or societies that are teetering on the edge of a democracy. I'll reflect back on my testimony earlier, but the very fundamental strategy of the Kremlin when it creates an attempt to disrupt a democratic society is to just sow chaos. It's about making the truth seem so elusive that nothing can be believed. And that's what we're really up against. They say a lie can go around the world while the truth is putting its shoes on. And so it's a very, very difficult thing to combat a persistent attempt to just make everything seem to be a lie. Because if everything's a lie, then the Russians can step in and then whatever they want to do, they do. And so that's the battlefield that we're on, and we're engaged on many, many levels, both in terms of our journalism and our content, but also through our fact-checking websites that are on an hourly basis disputing Russian lies with facts and truthfulness. It's a battle out there. I mean, I can't say we're at the promised land or that we've reached the epiphany of making all of this go away, but we're engaged. I think the one thing I guess I would ask, and I know you get asked a lot since you're on the Appropriations Subcommittee, is, just help us fund the effort. It's becoming more and more expensive because the Russians are sparing no expense in disrupting all of these democratic institutions. And I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I agree very much with the pattern that was referred to. The pattern is to create chaos, to seize any opportunity to go in and confuse and divert and undermine processes that are underway. It's opportunistic, and it's opportunistic across the board. In terms of backsliding and some of the countries, the EU and NATO members in Eastern Europe, the importance is to make sure that the institutions and the process and the media capabilities that we built remain in place. And so even as the Secretary was in Hungary last February, he announced a program, a regional program, to invite investigative journalists from Eastern Europe to the U.S. To make sure that that they had all the tools at their availability to continue to be able to watch out for the kind of corrupt influences that is one of the means Russia uses to insert its messages. So those efforts, those regional efforts are underway. $700,000 grant program has hit the streets. The grants applications are in, and we're going through them as we speak to make sure that capability remains. We're also able to work with NED, for instance, in the region, and NED has several grants funded to promote freedom of information and democratic ideals in the region. So we have ways of making sure, even as we pursue the strategy of engagement with the democratic leaders of those countries, to assure that the capabilities that are necessary to battle back remain in place and are renewed and strengthened.
I can't resist again before I turn to Ms. Frankel, but we won USA soccer match, right? I can't believe that how difficult it is we can't win this battle. So I am really interested in pursuing the questions that Mr. Price asked, and I think we're all asking. We know it's a battle, but we've got to win. And there's certainly a lot of money being put on the table, and the reason we wanted to have this hearing to ensure that we are spending the money in the most effective way and not just continuing business as usual. Because I've seen many of the buildings, I've talked to many of the people, and the expertise is here, certainly in the private sector, and I'm hoping that we will clearly focus and win this battle. But Ms. Frankel is next. Thank you.
I think you're being kind when you call it a battle. I would say we're in a war. And what I would be interested in, Madam Chair, and I thank you for this hearing, is to have a comparison between how much we're spending on tanks and bombers and so forth versus how much we're spending to counter this cyber warfare, because it seems to me that this is the war of the, are we in the 21st century? Yes. I want to ask you specifically, what is the lines of Russian propaganda? What kind of information are they getting out specifically? What are the tales that they're telling, their fake news? What do you see? And let me just, I'm going to add something to the question. Do the Russians ever use any of our president's statements in their propaganda? Such as the Russian interference in our elections is a hoax, or he believes Putin when it comes to Russian interference?
So as far as the lies that Russia tells, Russia is, of course, the most expansive and aggressive actor in this space. And I want to clarify what I did say earlier. When I say that Russia primarily targets the U.S., what I mean is us, our allies, our Western institutions, those bonds that we have, anything that basically undermines the type of society that they want to have. But as far as the lines of effort, we've been saying they covertly plant false stories. They use...
just tell me, give me a couple of examples of fake stories, because we've been talking in generalities. I'd like to know what kind of information they're spreading. What are they saying, for example?
Well, it really depends on the country, and I
just give me an example. Pick a country and give me an example.
Okay.
Anybody can help her.
I'll help her.
Go ahead.
No, she doesn't need help. She's doing a great job. You know, the thing is, it's interesting. The Russians are really not pushing a particular narrative other than nothing's true. That you can't have any faith in any institution. That a democracy.
Well, excuse me, I don't want
just
to be
matters.
rude. Just tell me how they do it. What do they say? What did they show? What did they?
For example, when MH was it 17 was shot down in eastern Ukraine. The Russian narrative on that was that the Americans loaded the plane with a bunch of dead bodies and shot it down themselves so they could blame the Russians.
Okay.
There's an example.
Okay. Have they ever used any of the words of our president in any of their disinformation?
I'm sure they have, of course.
Well, you're sure they have. Of course, you would know. Can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, they take the news as we receive it or as we broadcast it, and they distort it and change it.
Well, how about the president's comments over and over that the Russian interference with our election is a hoax? How about his statements in was it Helsinki, where he stood up next to Putin and said, well, why shouldn't I believe him? He said the Russians didn't interfere with the election. Have you ever know of any times where that information was spread by the Russians in other countries?
So we're developing analytics and research capabilities where we can look into and we can assess things like that. I want to just answer your question that you asked before about some of the other.
No, answer that.
Okay.
Okay.
So I will tell you this.
Yes.
The Russian will use every division possible to fragment us as a country. They will use your words. They will use my words. They will use the president's words. They will use any words they can to divide us and to separate us. So absolutely any little string we give them of division, they will exploit that. That is their tactic.
Okay, so thank you. I guess your answer to my question is yes, they have used the president's words. All right, so, and thank you for that example. That was very, any other examples any of you can give me? Yeah.
The poisoning of UK citizens in Salisbury, England, energy development and distribution, NATO exercises and deployments, the crisis in Venezuela, and countless other topics. Again, they will use your words, they will use my words, they will use any words they can to divide us.
And how do you pick your targets, which countries you're going to be working in?
Well, we pick our targets. We work with basically all countries in the region that we work in. We pick our targets in conjunction with the guidance that you provide us. So our targets are your targets, which are priority Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. But we work with the balance of the countries. The Western Balkans are extremely important to us. But we work with you on determining where the funds go and how we choose our targets.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, my time's run out, but I do again want to just request that I really think it'd be interesting to see the amount of money we spend on this counterintelligence work or whatever, because you have different TV, internet, so forth. I'd like to see how much you spend and compare to the hardware, the money we spend on hardware, and even on our troops. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I was just discussing with staff that I wish we had a couple more hours because this panel is so invaluable, and we are not finished yet. We have Ms. Torres, and then we have another panel, so we'll have to bring you back another time. But Ms. Torres.
Thank you. I'm going to try to be very brief with my questions. Piggyback on what was just asked. How is the information and the images of toddlers behind jail cells and having nothing but a sheet of aluminum to cover themselves, pooping themselves, nobody feeding them? How are those images being portrayed to the world about America?
In the same way that any American journalistic enterprise is reporting that story, our journalists
Are they being
report the story.
truthful about
Yes.
what's going out there,
No,
or are they spinning that to create an image of
Congressman
America
Torres,
that it's
we
not?
don't spin anything. We report
Not
the news.
you.
No.
I'm asking how the Russians.
Oh, how the
are-
Russians
Yes.
are. Well, I can't give you a specific example
You're
of how
the
they're covering
friendly
it.
ones, remember.
Yeah, we're the friendlies.
Yes.
names.
I don't have a specific example. I can only assure you that they're looking for a way to report that story in a way that makes America look like
Will you
it's...
report back to the committee on,
Yeah,
how
course.
those images are being
Sure.
I'm very concerned about
How the Russians are reporting
how
on
the
that story.
Russians are
Sure.
reporting that and how that information is being utilized to diminish, our standing as a global leader. So I want to bring the conversation back to our hemisphere and Latin America. So beyond Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, where have you detected significant Russian influence in Latin America? And to what extent does corruption make countries more vulnerable to Russian influence?
Yeah. Well, you named the countries that are most influenced by the Russians, starting with Cuba and Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador. I think throughout, wherever you see, I think, a Latin America country that is backsliding in democratic ideals, I think you'll find the Russians there helping to make that happen.
Specifically to the Northern Triangle, how is corruption there being
The corruption, I think, is something that is largely the result of Russian influence.
Any of you have anything else to add to that?
Well, we're certainly seeing Russian influence in Venezuela, of course, as well as other adversary actors in Venezuela trying to influence their local populations. And for the GEC, part of our mandate is recognizing and understanding where propaganda and disinformation are occurring globally. That's part of the reason that we have dedicated intelligence officers from the intelligence community who are detailed into our spaces at the GEC to assist with us and to point out when there are specific areas that we need to look at.
I think we have to pay attention to our hemisphere. Yeah. About 3 years ago, I was in Chile. They had a partnership with Russia with satellites, satellite infrastructure that was being built there. So I think that we need to pay special attention to our hemisphere and how this administration is treating migrants that are coming here seeking asylum, and how that information is being utilized against our moral values as American citizens. And with that, I yield back.
I know that all of us would like to continue, but we have a second panel waiting. So I certainly would like to thank our witnesses, and you could be assured that we will invite you back sooner rather than later to continue this discussion. Thank you very much for being here today. And we will recess just for one moment to transition to the second panel because we took so much time with your excellent presentations. Thank you.
Hopefully, I think they'll be able to give some of the details or some of the examples that these folks didn't provide.
Well, the problem is, Ms. Polyakova, Ms. Jankowicz, I want to really thank you for joining us today. If you would be kind enough to summarize your oral statement, we would be happy to place your full testimonies into the record. And after your testimony, I will call on members alternating between majority and minority. Each member is asked to keep questions to within 4 minutes per round. I do want to say, because this subject is of such interest to all of us, we get a little carried away, so we're going to have to keep to our time frame. And so after your testimony, I'll call on members alternating between majority and minority. Ms. Polyakova, please proceed.
Thank you. Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it's truly an honor and privilege to address you today on this important issue. Thank you for inviting me to testify. President Vladimir Putin's Russia seeks to weaken Western governments and transatlantic institutions, discredit democratic values, and create a post-truth world. Russian disinformation doesn't stop when the ballot box closes. Elections may provide an ideal high-impact opportunity for a disinformation actor like the Kremlin, but the barrage of disinformation against Western democracies, including that of the United States, continues long between election cycles. Disinformation, as one tool of Russia's political warfare, is certainly not new. But what is new is that today, what used to take years simply takes minutes. The advance of digital technology and communication allows for the high-speed spread of disinformation, rapid amplification of misleading content, and massive manipulation via unsecured points of influence. I've been working on Russian disinformation long before it became the issue du jour 3 years ago. Likewise, Russia's democratic and pro-Western neighbors, especially Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states, have contended with Russian disinformation attack for years. The United States and Western European countries woke up late to the challenge. But since the 2016 wake-up call, as you said, Congresswoman Lowy, European governments, the European Union, Canada, the United States have moved beyond, quote-unquote, admiring the problem and have entered what I think of as a new period of trial and error, where we are trying new efforts and new policies to counter this threat. 4 insights have emerged over the last 3.5 years. These are based on my many conversations with my European colleagues on the research side, European governments, and others in the private sector, including the social media platforms. First, there is no silver bullet for addressing the disinformation challenge. Governmental policy on its own will not be enough. What we need is a whole of society approach that includes stakeholders from the private sector, independent media, and civil society. Second, exposure identification of specific malicious entities like Russian bots and trolls is necessary but not sufficient to curb the spread of foreign disinformation. As we respond, our adversaries evolve. 3, the democratic response to state-sponsored information warfare must be rooted in democratic principles of transparency, accountability, and integrity. As we learned during the Cold War, we need not become them to beat them. Lastly, malicious disinformation attacks are not limited to one country. All democracies are equally affected. That is why the Transatlantic Alliance should be the basis of a counter-disinformation coalition in which the United States should play a leading role. Unfortunately, the United States, as you rightfully noted, has fallen behind Europe in both conceptualizing the nature of the challenge and operationalizing concrete steps to counter and build resilience against disinformation. In my written testimony, I have detailed the nature of the Russian threat, European and U.S. responses, and what else needs to be done by this legislative body and the administration. Here, I'll focus on a few specific policy recommendations relevant to this committee and the administration. I apologize, I will go about 30 seconds over. During the Cold War, the United States developed and invested in a messaging and media infrastructure that was well suited for the communications environment at the time. I can speak from personal experience growing up in the Soviet Union in the 1980s that we relied on Radio Liberty and Voice of America to provide truthful information about our own country that we certainly did not receive from the Soviet authorities. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. After the Cold War, the U.S. ceded that space, and with it, our ability to project democratic values and principles into the frontline states.
Today, the communications environment has been revolutionized and transformed by the digital revolution, but the U.S. media apparatus is not kept up. A 20th century model for countering 21st century disinformation will fail. We need to take urgent and critical steps today. First, the U.S. Congress should invest in a real way in rebuilding our messaging capabilities to reach vulnerable populations in the frontline states, as you have already, but on top of that, we need to focus on building and appropriating appropriate funds to build capacity of civil society, media, and other non-governmental organizations. To that end, Congress should authorize an appropriate funds to further develop RFVRL's and VOA's current time program that we heard about earlier today, and allow it to expand further into the former Warsaw Pact countries. Lastly, this Congress should also continue to put pressure on the administration to ensure the administration continues to impose sanctions on foreign officials or officially controlled purveyors of disinformation and their sponsors. I can go on, but just to close, I will say these recommendations, as are outlined in my written testimony, are low-hanging fruit. They will not in themselves curb the tide of disinformation. We must take the leadership in this space in addressing foreign disinformation specifically. To do otherwise will be to leave this arena open to authoritarians to set the rules of the game. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jankowicz.
Chairman Lowy, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to testify before you today on a topic of utmost importance to the United States, our values, and our standing in the world. For the past 3 years, I have been on the front lines of the information war, most recently in Ukraine, Lithuania, and Georgia. I have worked alongside, interviewed, and briefed policymakers throughout the region, and these experiences present a grim picture. The United States is abdicating its leadership in countering Russian disinformation. Where we ought to be setting the rules of engagement, the tone, and the moral compass in responding to Russia's information war, the United States has been a tardy, timid, or tertiary player, with much of our public servants' good work on this issue stymied by domestic politicization. Disinformation is not a political issue, it is a democratic one. By convening this hearing, I know the members of this subcommittee recognize that, and I hope you continue to reflect this sentiment in your appropriations decisions. Beyond that challenge, the U.S. has not invested sufficient resources to be competitive in this fight. Russian information warfare continues to target the U.S. and our allies, as well as the rules-based international order. It does so through increasingly hard-to-track tactics that I outline in my written testimony. However, countering it has not been a budgetary priority. Russia has not met the same budgetary challenge. After struggling to gain an informational foothold during the 2008 war with Georgia, the editor-in-chief of RT, Russia's state-sponsored foreign propaganda outlet, described the conflict as a watershed moment. She said, "In 2008, it became absolutely clear to everyone why we need such a thing as an international television channel representing the country. And of course, they began to pay more attention and understand that it costs money," end quote. The budget for RT, arguably one of the least effective arms of Russian disinformation, is $277 million in 2020. I am not advocating that the U.S. match the Russian government's spending on information warfare, nor am I arguing that we mimic its tactics. Instead, we must invest more in the tools already at our disposal with an eye on empowering individuals, not endlessly fact-checking or playing whack-a-troll. Congress should invest more in programs that, first, teach people how to navigate the modern information environment, including through digital literacy training outside of the context of Russian disinformation. Second, we should inject more reliable information into the ecosystem using existed trusting vectors, such as Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America, and invest in the sustainability of local and independent media outlets, rather than just training and capability building. Third, we should engage people in countries on the front lines of the information war with firsthand exchange experiences in and about the United States through programs including Fulbright, IVLP, and Flex. It's time for the U.S. to get serious about addressing disinformation, and to do so in part by targeting those most affected by it, regular people. None of these initiatives are political. They focus on empowering individuals to be active and informed citizens through generational investments in democratic discourse, civic engagement, and truth. Ultimately, these recommendations are a manifestation of America's greatest strength, our values. Thank you.
Well, I want to first thank both of you for appearing before us, and I know we will continue our dialogue. We appreciate your expertise, and I know that all of us on this panel understand the urgency of the messages you are sending. So I'm going to be brief and turn to my colleagues, or maybe I will conclude and turn to my colleagues for their question. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Can you tell us what is the impact of Russian misinformation? What damage is it doing, and to whom, and why? Either of you? Ms. Polyakova?
I'd be happy to begin, Congressman, and I'm sure my colleague will follow up. If we start asking the question whether Russian disinformation leads to specific outcomes, like the outcome of an election, that is the wrong way to look at this. I think of it as a slow drip of a desire to shape the public narrative and the public view around specific events that are of strategic national interest to the Kremlin. Specifically, when the Maidan revolution was happening in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, the Russian narrative was that a democratic demonstration that was peaceful was actually a fascist coup, led and orchestrated by the United States and especially the State Department and the CIA. At the time, this view propagated and was amplified in mainstream media, including seeping into our mainstream media. So to my mind, the effect is that it damages the United States and our allies' images abroad. It undermines our society at home, and it continues to drive wedges between us and our allies internally and externally.
And I'll follow up with a recent example from the Ukrainian elections in 2019. I think the main narrative that Russia was trying to push, although it was less active in these Ukrainian elections than it had been in the past, was that the outcome was already decided. Ukrainians shouldn't bother going out to vote. There were all these oligarchic interests involved in the election, and really there was no democracy to be had there. Of course, Ukraine proved Russia wrong, right? But the idea here is to build distrust in the democratic system writ large. It encourages people not to go out and vote, not to participate, and to question everything that they're saying to a conspiratorial kind of degree, rather than participating in democratic debate and discourse to support the democratic system. And I think that, of course, is damaging to United States interests and damaging to the democratic system writ large around the globe.
Thank you. I yield.
Ms. Lee?
Thank you very much. Thank you both for being here. I think I'd address this question to Dr. Polyakova. I recently traveled to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia with the Bipartisan House Democracy Partnership, where we heard and saw firsthand the impact that Russian disinformation has on undermining political stability and democratic processes. Of course, it was very familiar to me as an American. You've stated in your testimony that a democratic response to state-sponsored information warfare must be rooted in democratic principles of transparency, accountability, and integrity, and that these principles should be guiding United States policy. Now, I have grave concerns about just how transparent and accountable the U.S. government is when it comes to addressing the significant challenges around countering Russian disinformation machines, particularly in our own country. It certainly has done damage here. You also stated in your testimony that the U.S. has made little progress in addressing the misinformation challenge and that it remains unclear who in the U.S. government owns the problem. Now, of course, we know Russia took sides in the presidential elections here in America. That's a documented fact, and their candidate, Donald Trump, won. That's a fact. So let me ask you, how can the United States government better utilize what tools we have, including diplomacy and coordination across the whole of government, to ensure our success in countering the influence and disinformation by the Russians, both here at home in America and abroad?
Thank you very much for the very good question, Congresswoman. Firstly, to focus on what we can do here at home. As we heard from the earlier panel, there are multiple U.S. agencies that coordinate the response to disinformation problem. It remains a problem with no clear high-level political leadership at the, let's say, undersecretary level or above. In a recent report that co-authored with a longtime State Department Foreign Service Officer, Ambassador Dan Fried, called Democratic Defense Against Disinformation, we outline a long series of recommendations, and I'll be happy to share that full report with you as well following this testimony. Some of the highlights, however, include is that best practices from European governments that are ahead of the United States in this space, notably Sweden, I would point to that, Estonia, and to a certain extent, France has taken the international leadership role in crafting a set of common understandings of allied and like-minded democracies. Some of the best practices from the European context are, one, there needs to be high-level political leadership that coordinates U.S. governmental efforts at interagency level. Multiple versions of this have been proposed, whether that be in last year's minority report from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that requested or proposed an NCTC-style model for counter-disinformation. A fusion cell is something has been called as well, to be housed in any of the U.S. agency, but DHS clearly has the homeland mandate. And DHS so far has focused on hard security versus information security. So that's on the domestic front. If you allow me 1 second, on the foreign front, which of course is the main concern of this committee, we need to reinvest in supporting independent civil society in those frontline states. The Balkans, I would put as a potential area that will lead to some conflict in the near future. Russia owns that media space. What I see over and over again is RT and other similar services provided local language information in the same way that AP provides cable news. That is then pasted usually without any attribution into local newspapers. And you can imagine what kind of information, quote unquote, I put that in quotes, that is. It's certainly not information that is anything positive about the West or the United States.
Madam Chair, I would suggest that if these recommendations have been made, and if they haven't been embraced by the highest levels of our government as it relates to our own efforts to stop the disinformation, then we're complicit in this. And so we need to really figure out why these recommendations haven't been addressed, especially with elections coming up, because otherwise, you know, it's like hands off, you know.
If I may have 1 second, I think if we want to understand the kinds of threats that we will face in the future here in this country, we must look to those frontline states like Ukraine, who have been undergoing these kinds of attacks for decades. And everything that we've seen happen in this country has happened there before.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few questions, and hopefully you can all sum up, because clearly we're going to meet again. And I apologize, but there are so many other hearings going on. It was not for a lack of interest that colleagues on both sides of the aisle have wandered off. So I'm going to ask a couple of things, and then I know we will meet another day. First of all, in the first panel, we heard from CEO Lansing of the United States Agency for Global Media. My first question is, how can we use their platforms, including the VOA and Radio Free Europe, which you touched on, to reach audiences, break through the noise and clutter of the 21st century media environment? Or are these agencies not relevant today? Secondly, what role can and should U.S.-funded independent media play in fighting Russian disinformation and malign influence? What role does forceful diplomacy play in the battle against disinformation? Do the United States and our allies adequately prioritize disinformation efforts for our diplomatic discussions with Russia, China, and others who engage aggressively in these attacks? I don't mean to have you taking all these notes, but I'd like you to sum up addressing these issues. And which countries have done the best at responding to disinformation campaigns? And can we learn from these lessons? And Ms. Polyakova, or Dr. Polyakova, you have cited the EU's rapid alert system as an example of progress in Europe in fighting disinformation. I thought it was interesting that over the weekend, the New York Times carried an article that questions the system's effectiveness to date. How do you evaluate the New York Times piece and of the rapid alert system's effectiveness to date? And Ms. Jankowicz, you've written that Moscow has used Ukraine as a disinformation laboratory for years. So if you can describe Russia's actions in Ukraine, what it learned, the results from such actions, and how Russia applies lessons from Ukraine elsewhere. I would be most appreciative if you could address those points, sum up as best you can. You know we're going to bring you before us again because your information is so vital. And as I thank you again, I'd like you to sum up. You heard the other testimony first from the first panel. I know you feel this is urgent. I feel it's absolutely urgent. I know Mr. Rogers agrees with me. Help us as to what the next step should be. And perhaps the next step should be in a classified setting so that we can really understand exactly what's going on. I don't think there's an issue, and I say this all the time, that is more important and more urgent than addressing what Russia is doing, especially as a result of their actions in the last election. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lowy, and I just want to acknowledge your leadership and the leadership of Congressman Rogers on the issue of Ukraine, Russia especially. You've certainly been an important voice in helping us understand Russia's hybrid warfare and political warfare against its neighbors. And I completely agree with my colleague's written testimony that Ukraine is the testing bed for Russian techniques, and this is where we must look to understand what's coming to us. To address your specific questions regarding the European so-called rapid alert system, in the report I mentioned earlier, we do assess, and that came out before the New York Times article, we assess that system as potentially useful if it's fully implemented. At the time it was not fully implemented. It remains unimplemented today, which is a shortcoming of the EU efforts in this space. However, while I agree with the criticism of the New York Times article and cited in my written testimony as well, I think it serves as an interesting potential model from where we should learn from in the United States. It's basically an information sharing mechanism. Obviously, the EU is very different than the United States. It's a country with 28 member states that have not been sharing information in a productive, concrete process when each country faces a disinformation attack or information manipulation. So hopefully, if with a little bit more time, the so-called RAS system will be stood up and will be effective for information sharing. I think we can learn from the mistakes and successes of the EU as it seeks out certain solutions. In my written testimony, I also recommend that the United States, looking at some of the European pitfalls and successes, considers implementing a US-style rapid alert system as well that could only be operational, for example, during election cycles, which is not the only time disinformation occurs, but certainly a peak and a huge opportunity for malicious actors. I think we should look to Europe and to learn from them. I already mentioned Sweden as a potential country that we should look at for best practices. Again, Sweden, not the United States, the scale questions that I don't need to go into with you. However, there are some interesting things that they have done prior to their elections this past fall. One, the Civil Contingencies Agency, which is the Swedish equivalent of DHS, more or less, has established for the last few years a psychological defense agency. So they're deeply focused on cognitive security as part of information security and part of cybersecurity. I think we have something like this in the classified intelligence space, but without clearance, I cannot confirm that, to be honest with you. One thing that
Our next hearing will be classified.
I will say that the Civil Contingencies Agency, they did two things prior to secure their own elections. One, they sent out, I believe, to every household in Sweden, an information, very simple information pamphlet. What is this information? Why should it be something that concerns to you, that is of concern to you locally? You know, the equivalent being someone in a small town in Georgia, in Michigan, receiving something similar. What do you do if you think you are reading information that's inaccurate, as trying to manipulate you? Second, they sent out similar training materials to teachers in schools so that students could be better educated on how do you discern disinformation? What is it? Why is it an issue for you? So these are some of the efforts that I think we may want to look at. And thirdly, they have developed a communication information sharing between local, like city councils, and all the way to the federal level. And they have done trainings with civil servants. So internally, there's awareness within government, not just externally in the public. I think where we are today, and the reason why I say that we have lagged behind, is one, there's a lack of awareness internally within our government, and a lack of public awareness as a result of that. Because we haven't seen leadership at the highest level here in this country on this issue that would define the threat for the American people so they can better understand why they should care. Right now, I think your average American doesn't understand why they should care about Russian disinformation, and that's a big problem. Lastly, before I wrap up, you asked regarding USAGM and how we can better use those resources. In my written testimony, I basically outlined a proposal in which there is a full audit conducted of all of the services with an eye towards performance indicators, and that those services that are not performing in line with those indicators be significantly reduced. I do think RFERL has been very effective in its current time program that we saw the presentation of, but it is operating a shoestring budget as far as I can tell. It is not competing in terms of production values with RT by far. Again, I'm not advocating that we should match RT's budget, but I think with a redistribution of resources that takes funding away from some programs that are not performing, and that with a refocus on digital innovative solutions versus traditional media, again, this is the 21st century, this is the digital century. We're still operating as if we're, in the 20th century, everyone's watching their nightly news at 6 p.m. That's no longer the case. And again, just to point that these efforts during the Cold War were incredibly effective. Again, not just my personal experience, but certainly my personal experience, my family's experience in the 1980s speaks to that as part of the reason why we immigrated to this country, because we understood what the truth was about our own country that our authorities were not providing at the time. In my written testimony, I have lots of numbers that you can look at to see why we're not competitive with the Russian disinformation machine at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Ms. Jankowicz.
Thank you again for having me, Chairwoman. I'll start with Ukraine. There are a couple interesting developments in Ukraine that happened during the recent presidential election, and I would describe them as the Russian and other malign actors trying to move underground. We've put up a lot of obstacles, both through our advocacy as the United States and social media platforms as well, and some of this has been a bit of a smokescreen, right, so that the social media companies look like they're adequately addressing the problem. Malign actors have figured out how to exploit these barriers and get around these loopholes. One way that they're doing this, we talked a lot about ad buys and how the Russians bought ads. They do that in Ukraine, certainly. They're trying to get around those geographical ad restrictions by using ad mules. So they'll find people who are willing to rent out their authentic Facebook accounts for about $100 a month, and those people provide them access to those accounts. It looks like, an authentic Ukrainian is actually logging in and buying those ads, and then they're able to place those political ads. I would also say that Facebook has been extraordinarily lax in enforcing those policies, and that is something that needs to be addressed, but of course is beyond the oversight of this committee. In addition, we're seeing a lot more disinformation in groups and private messengers. So we've seen that happening in Brazil and India on WhatsApp, but recently in Ukraine and Lithuania, I tracked a lot of this information moving in private Facebook groups. This is extremely worrying to me because right now, the social media companies and Facebook in particular are, again, pivoting to privacy, which is a bit of a smokescreen, as I said, in order to make people feel more secure about their information online after countless errors on the social media companies' parts. But what that is doing is driving people to have conversations in these private fora, which researchers like us and journalists cannot track. And even the social media companies have a much more difficult time tracking and curating that information. And also, they're kind of insular communities. There's a lot more trust between these groups because it's people of a certain political ideology or a certain background. That trust is built up over time, as we saw in the 2016 election, and that is exploited to share malign narratives. This is something that's extremely worrisome to me. Facebook is incentivizing this behavior, and it's where we should look to the future from Ukraine. To address the question about RFERL and VOA, I have found these resources to be invaluable, not only in their English language coverage, which is one of the most important sources for informing experts like myself when we're not on the ground, but also their local language services are invaluable. I know the Georgian protests, which happened a couple of weeks ago, I turned to RFERL, my Georgian friends were turning to RFERL to look for coverage of the protests, especially in a politicized media environment like in Georgia. I would say that these entities face the same issues that U.S. media outlets are facing right now. They are competing in a very crowded information environment. They need more funding, just like the New York Times and local media outlets in the United States need in order to compete in this environment. It's not easy, but we need to understand that journalism is a public good and continue investing in that. I think that's critical. You discussed a little bit U.S. and our allies. Are we adequately prioritizing dialogue? I think the more dialogue we can do with our transatlantic allies, the better. The United Kingdom is leading right now, I would say, in terms of efforts to counter disinformation abroad. I think a great example of how their systems work, and I would add that they don't have one specific agency that is leading on this. They just have a really good coordination system in place. Look at the Salisbury poisonings and the diplomatic response that they were able to send in reaction to that tragic event. And then finally, you asked which countries did the best. Alina mentioned Estonia before. I love the Estonian example because it started with a lot of fact-checking and pushing back against the Russian narrative and ended, or is still ongoing, with investment in people. If you look at my testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee that I did last year, I go into that example in detail. And it's about education. It's about outreach. Again, what I spoke about in my testimony today. These generational investments are going to be the ones that win the battle in the long run. Ukraine is doing similar things with media literacy, as we heard about the Learn to Discern program. I think is a great model that is now being tried out in the United States by IREX. One thing that I would caution against doing is the infringements on freedom of speech that we're seeing in Ukraine. I wrote for The Atlantic about some of those issues, blocking and banning certain websites and social media. We don't want to go down that route. And then finally, I think I'll just add that democratic systems, the most robust democratic systems where people trust in the system, like Sweden, like Estonia, like Finland, are the ones that we see having the strongest resilience to disinformation. And so in that regard, I would encourage the committee to think a bit outside of the box and think about more investments in organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, programs that DRL, USAID, NDI, IRI are doing, because as we build up those systems, we're going to build more resilient populations. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, on behalf of Mr. Rogers and myself and the entire committee, I am so grateful to you. I thought your testimonies were outstanding, and I look forward to continuing to work with you as we evaluate the really good work of the agencies we currently fund, and hopefully, based on your advice, we can even provide more services to those agencies that are so desperately needed today throughout Europe. So thank you very much. Oh, I have to. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs stands adjourned. This concludes today's hearing. Thank you.
You have a second, just to